The castle of Valemore stood tall and gray against the mountains, its towers old and proud. Inside its stone walls lived a king that everyone respected, but no one dared to love. His name was Thane Ashgrave, and he carried a curse that had been passed down through his family for generations. When his anger grew too strong, or when the moon rose full and heavy in the sky, something inside him changed. His eyes turned darker, his hands grew claws, and his calm voice became a low, dangerous growl. The people called him the Beast King, though never to his face. On the day our story begins, King Thane had just returned from a long and difficult war at the northern border. His soldiers had won, but the victory had cost him more than land or gold. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. His control, the thin thread that kept the beast inside him quiet, was almost breaking. He walked into the council hall still wearing his travel-worn armor, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. The advisors bowed low, careful not to look him directly in the eyes for too long. They had learned over the years that a lingering stare could be seen as a challenge, and a challenge could wake the beast. Halfway through the meeting, as one of the older lords spoke about taxes and grain shortages, Thane's hand suddenly gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. A low sound rumbled in his throat, one that made every person in the room freeze. "Your Majesty?" the lord asked carefully. Thane did not answer. His shoulders began to shake. The candles on the table flickered as if sensing the danger. Then, without a word, every advisor in the room stood and hurried toward the doors, their robes rustling in panic. This was routine. When the king's control slipped, the wise thing to do was to leave before the change came fully. In the kitchens below the great hall, a young man named Elian was finishing his morning duties. He was an Omega, gentle by nature, with soft brown eyes and hands that always seemed to know how to comfort, whether it was calming a frightened animal in the stables or soothing a crying child in the servant quarters. He had only been working in the palace for a few months, transferred from a small village bakery after his skill with herbs and remedies caught the attention of the head cook. Elian had heard the stories about the king, of course. Everyone had. The whispered warnings, the frightened glances, the empty halls whenever the king's mood darkened. But Elian had never actually seen the change happen. He had only heard about it, the way one hears about a storm from someone who wasn't caught in it. That morning, carrying a tray of tea toward the private study where he had been told to leave refreshments, Elian took a wrong turn and found himself near the council hall just as the doors burst open. Advisors rushed past him, nearly knocking the tray from his hands. He pressed himself against the wall, confused, watching the flood of frightened faces. When the hallway finally emptied, Elian noticed the council hall door still open. Curiosity, or perhaps something deeper he could not name, pulled him forward. He peeked inside. There, alone in the middle of the grand room, was the king. He was on his knees, one hand braced against the stone floor, his other arm wrapped around himself as if trying to hold his own body together. His breathing was ragged. Dark claws had begun to grow from his fingertips, and faint lines, almost like scars, spread across his skin. He looked less like a monster and more like a man in terrible pain, fighting a battle no one could see. Every instinct told Elian to run, just as everyone else had. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands shook around the tray he still carried. But something about the sight of the king alone, suffering in silence with no one beside him, made Elian's feet move forward instead of backward. He set the tray down gently on a side table and walked toward the king. "Stay back," Thane managed to growl, his voice rough and strained. "Leave now." Elian did not leave. He knelt down in front of the king, close enough that he could see the pain etched deep into his face. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took Thane's trembling, half-clawed hand in both of his own. The touch seemed to shock them both. Thane's head snapped up, his dark eyes locking onto Elian's face, waiting for the fear that always came. But Elian did not flinch. He simply held the king's hand, his thumb gently tracing calm circles over the rough skin, the way he might soothe a frightened animal. Something strange happened. The growling in Thane's throat softened. His shoulders, tense and shaking, slowly began to loosen. The claws did not fully disappear, but they stopped growing longer. His breathing slowed, still ragged, but no longer wild. You should be afraid of me, Thane whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Maybe, Elion said softly. But you look like you need someone to stay more than you need someone to be afraid. They stayed like that for several long minutes, until the last traces of the change faded from Thane's body, and his hands returned to normal. When he finally looked up at Elion fully, there was something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that had not been seen in the king's eyes for a very long time. Word of what happened spread quietly through the castle, though no one spoke of it openly. The head cook noticed Elion was quieter than usual that evening, lost in thought. A guard who had seen Elion walking calmly out of the council hall mentioned it to another, who mentioned it to someone else, until the whispers reached even the king's personal advisors. The next morning, Thane summoned Elion to his private study. When Elion arrived, nervous but steady, the king was standing by the window, his back turned. "What you did yesterday was foolish," Thane said without turning around. "You could have been hurt, badly." "I know," Elion replied honestly. "Then why did you stay?" Elion thought for a moment before answering. "Because everyone else left you alone with something you didn't choose. That didn't seem fair." Thane finally turned to face him. There was a guardedness in his expression, a wall built from years of solitude. "You don't understand what I am. This isn't something that happens once. It will happen again, and next time, I might not be able to hold it back." "Then I'll be there next time too," Elion said simply. Thane wanted to argue, wanted to send him away and insist that Elion return to the kitchens and forget what he had seen. But something about the quiet certainty in Elion's voice made the words die in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, and told Elion he was reassigned to assist in the royal chambers, a position that would keep him close. In the weeks that followed, a fragile friendship began to grow between them. Elion learned the signs that came before Thane's episodes, the way his jaw would tighten, the way his hands would curl slightly at his sides, the restless energy that built in him like a storm gathering strength. He learned to bring him tea infused with calming herbs before council meetings, to speak to him in a low, steady voice when the tension grew too high, to simply sit nearby without demanding anything, letting his quiet presence be enough. Thane, in turn, began to open up in small ways. He told Elion about his childhood, about the day his father first explained the curse to him, about the loneliness of growing up feared by his own family. He taught Elion simple sword forms in the empty training yard after sunset, not because Elion needed to fight, but because he wanted him to be able to protect himself if the world outside the castle ever turned dangerous. Elion, in return, taught Thane how to sit still in the garden and simply breathe, how to notice small good things in his day, even when the weight of ruling a kingdom pressed heavily on his shoulders. They shared quiet meals in the kitchen after the rest of the staff had gone to sleep, laughing softly over simple jokes, the king's rare smile becoming less rare with each passing week. Slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, something deeper than friendship began to take root. Not everyone in the castle was pleased by this change. Several nobles on the council had grown comfortable with a king who ruled from fear and isolation, one who rarely questioned their advice, because he had no one else to trust. A close, steady bond between the king and a lowly Omega threatened their quiet influence over him. Lord Corvin, the most ambitious among them, began to see Elion as an obstacle. He started spreading careful rumors, suggesting that Elion was manipulating the king, using false kindness to gain power and favor. When rumors did not work quickly enough, Corvin arranged for a valuable ring to disappear from the treasury, and made certain that evidence pointed toward Elion. Guards came for Elion one evening, while he was preparing herbs in the kitchen. He was brought before the council, accused of theft, his protests met with cold, doubtful stares from men who had already decided his guilt. When Thane heard what had happened, he arrived at the council hall with a fury the court had rarely witnessed, though this time, his anger did not come from the curse. It came from something far more human. He listened to the accusations, then calmly but firmly demanded proof. When none could be truly provided beyond circumstance and whispers, he declared Elion innocent and placed him under royal protection, his voice leaving no room for argument. Lord Corvin, furious that his plan had failed so easily, decided on a more desperate plan. A grand feast was to be held soon, celebrating the kingdom's recent victory at the border. Corvin saw an opportunity. If he could provoke the king into losing control in front of the entire court and the visiting nobles from neighboring lands, it would be impossible to hide the truth any longer. The king would be seen as unfit to rule, and Corvin could push for a change in leadership. On the night of the feast, the great hall glittered with candlelight and music. Nobles from across the region gathered, admiring the kingdom's wealth and strength. Thane, dressed in formal robes, stood tall beside his throne, doing his best to appear calm, despite the exhaustion of recent weeks. Partway through the celebration, Corvin approached with practiced politeness, offering a toast that seemed harmless enough at first. But hidden within his carefully chosen words were sharp insults directed at Thane's mother, long past, along with subtle mockery of the very curse that had shaped his entire life. The words were designed to strike where it would hurt most. Thane's calm control began to crack. His hands clenched at his sides, a low sound built in his throat, and around the hall, guests began to notice, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Guards, trained for exactly this moment, moved their hands toward their weapons. From across the hall, Elian saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he pushed through the crowd of startled nobles, ignoring the murmurs and gasps around him. He reached Thane just as the first signs of the change began to show, the darkening of his eyes, the slight lengthening of his nails. Elian did not step back. He took Thane's shaking hands in his own, right there in front of the entire court, and looked up into his eyes. "I'm here," Elian said softly, his voice cutting through the growing tension. "You are not alone in this. You never have to be." The hall fell silent, every noble and guard watching, waiting. Thane's breathing was ragged, his body trembling with the effort of holding back the change. But slowly, guided by the warmth of Elian's steady hands and the quiet certainty in his voice, the darkness in his eyes began to fade. His shoulders relaxed, the claws retreated, the low growl faded into silence. The court, expecting to witness a monster, instead witnessed something far more powerful, a king who was gentle enough to be steadied and strong enough to fight his own nature with help rather than fear. Corvin's plan had failed completely, and his cruel words in front of so many witnesses left no doubt about his intentions. Within days, evidence of his scheming against Elian came to light as well, and he was stripped of his position and removed from court, his ambitions ending in disgrace. In the quiet days that followed, Thane found Elian in the garden they had once shared quiet mornings in. The autumn air was cool, and golden leaves drifted slowly to the ground around them. "I spent years pushing everyone away," Thane said softly, "believing it was the only way to keep them safe from what I am, but you never let me push you far enough." Elian smiled gently. "Maybe you never truly wanted me to." Thane reached out and took his hand, no longer shaking, no longer frightened of what the touch might reveal. "Stay with me," he said quietly, "not as someone I need to survive, but as someone I choose." Elian's eyes softened, and he laced his fingers with the king's. "I already chose you," he said. "A long time ago, in that council hall, when I decided to stay." The kingdom that had once feared its beast king slowly began to see him differently, not as a monster to be avoided, but as a man who had finally found someone brave enough and gentle enough to hold his hand through the storm. And in the years that followed, whenever the old stories of the Beast King were told to children by the fireside, they were no longer stories of fear. They were stories of love.